Okay, guys, buckle up. Part two is going to be a little bit shorter, but we're going to move more quickly through a number of slides here. So let's just look at some basic data. A lot of these maps are in your textbook already, and we can tell that most of the country is still dominated by white non-Hispanic people racially, as they describe it themselves, or sorry, as they ascribe it to themselves, especially rural America. We can look also at the location of Hispanics in the United States, and you'll notice familiar patterns that in those states that once were a part of Mexico, including Texas, New Mexico, California, etc., is the same area where we still see the largest percentage of Latinos and Hispanics. And it's important to remember that a lot of the people that live here never crossed a border into the United States, but rather the border crossed them at the end of the war between the United States and Mexico. It's also important to note that politically and in terms of ethnicity and in history, the Latinos in the American Southwest are often very different from the Latinos, for example, in South Florida. South Florida is dominated by Latinos from the Caribbean, especially Cuba. Also people from the Dominican Republic, and increasingly people from Puerto Rico that have moved into Florida. And there's a different experience, again, a different kind of imagined history, if you remember that term, from a lot of the Latinos that live in the American Southwest. Okay. The map of African Americans in this country is very much a stark reminder of the history of slavery. Not to keep talking about this over and over again, right? But it's a little bit surprising that even 150 years after emancipation of African Americans in this country, that the map of African American locations is still very similar to the map that you would have seen immediately after the end of slavery in 1865. And so most people have chosen never to leave the South. Maybe that's connected to your own family experience. Sometimes I do an exercise with students and ask them to investigate their own family history. And it's very common for people of African American descent to describe their experience as having family that's always been in the South. And it's important to remember also that for African Americans, that history is much more difficult to find than it is for a lot of white Americans or even Latinos who have a more direct connection kind of to their family's past. Much smaller in number, the Asian American experience is still has a geographic pattern to it. So specifically along the West Coast and Washington, along the East Coast. And so geography still matters here. I've hidden the portion that shows Hawaii by mistake, but it's important to keep in mind that Hawaii is the only state in the United States that's not a majority white state, and the largest percentage of those ethnically and racially describe themselves in Africa as Asian or Asian Pacific Islander. So that's important. Maybe you take note. Maybe you should take notes on that, even though I don't have it on the slide here. Okay, in other parts of the country, there's still a clustering effect. So within the state of Georgia, you find huge numbers of Asian people often living in the same neighborhood or in the same zip codes and attending the same schools. And those of you that live in Gwinnett County or in the Atlanta area, you know this very well, right? You know where you can go shopping and you can find Asi or H Mart or a number of other grocery stores that are focused on Asian goods. We understand the history, hopefully, I've mentioned it a couple times, of the Native American experience. And so specifically there it is. In 1830, the United States passed the Indian Removal Act in spite of a promise to allow Cherokee and Choctaw and other tribes to remain in their homelands here in the American Southeast. We engaged in the forceful removal of those people out of the American Southeast and across the Mississippi into the great American West. And so again, you still see that in a map of the United States of America in 2025, in spite of the fact that this is something that occurs almost 200 years ago. Moreover, indigenous people of the United States were not fully considered citizens until just the 20th century in 1924, about 100 years ago. Then we see the distribution of some other race, which I've already talked about, and also two or more races. So it's increasingly clear that those that are selecting some other race or two or more races very often were Latino or Hispanic and didn't feel that there was a racial categorization for them to choose in the census forms. Some of these people are also probably from the Middle East, from Syria, or from other parts of the world in which they don't feel connected to any of the racial categories that were offered to them. So beyond the scale of just the nation, it's important to understand that traditionally racial and ethnic minorities have settled across these kind of three patterns. It says two scales here, but it should say three. First, large cities, because traditionally that's where job opportunities occurred, especially among immigrant groups arriving in the late 19th, early 20th century to the United States. They very much settled in New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, places like that, and then in individual neighborhoods within large cities. So not just to the city, but very specific neighborhoods, also known as enclaves within those cities. Recently, in the late 20th and early 21st century, we're seeing an increasing explosion of growth of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians in suburbs. And if you live in a suburb, you can probably attest to that. So early migration, again, 19th century, 20th century migration takes place in cities like Chicago, and to this day, even in the 21st century, there are very specific neighborhoods that are defined by those immigrant groups that arrived and stayed close to one another, sometimes by force, sometimes because it was just more comfortable to do that. In the case of the arrival of African Americans to Chicago, it was enforced by law. So yeah, to this day, I grew up in Illinois, and everybody knows when you visit Chicago, you can find a Polish neighborhood. You're going to find some really good Polish food. You'll see it reflected even on the signs, the names of streets in certain neighborhoods, with different kinds of people being reflected as being remembered in those neighborhoods. And sometimes these neighborhoods are very close to one another. You can even see the same thing in newer cities. Even though the migration history is very different, you can see this specific separation in the city of Charlotte by race, right? And it's very much kind of a black and white separation. It's also interesting to note how effective highways and things like that are to serve as borders between one racial group and the other. I don't know the names of these highways, but you can see how there's sort of this wedge here, right, between the white population in the south of Charlotte and other groups north and northwest and northeast of that. And then we could bring it home a little bit, and we've got one more to look at, San Francisco. This says something about migration patterns into San Francisco and settlement patterns, especially of Asians in the early part of the middle part of the 19th century and the latter part of the 19th century. So there are long-standing neighborhoods, and there's a very strong Chinatown, which of course is not entirely authentic at all. But there still are long-standing traditional Chinese and Asian neighborhoods in San Francisco that you don't find in other parts of the country. And then finally, to make it more local, we could even look at the location of Georgia Gwinnett College, which is, let's see, it's right around here. And we can see that the racial patterns are a lot more complex, right? It's not necessarily a white-black divide. There's Hispanic, Latino, Asian, multiple others that maybe don't show up on this map that you can see here. And if you live in this area, you know this map very, very well. You know that there are major Asian neighborhoods in and around Duluth, along Pleasant Hill Drive, and it's interesting to note that the Hispanic community has very much shot up kind of right around the corridor of I-85 and Buford Highway right in here, and on both sides of I-85. And maybe there are reasons for that, maybe there aren't, but it's just kind of interesting pattern. So let's talk about African American forced migration, right? And a part of the triangular trade, slave trade. You've learned this since the time you were in elementary school, so I don't want to bang anybody over the head with it, right? The knowledge should already be inside of you, but just as a reminder, it was a triangular slave trade, and it was most active from 1700 to 1850. The transatlantic slave trade ends in 1808, but of course slavery in the United States continues through to 1865. But here's what I want to kind of maybe emphasize that may not be so obvious to you, right? So while we talk about the end of slavery occurring in 1865, which is almost 150 years ago, that may seem like worlds and worlds away from where we are now as a society. And I think most of us would agree that racial relations have improved in the United States since 1865. On the other hand, I've already shown you on the map that the location of African Americans in the 21st century is not that different from where it was in very much at the end of the slavery period. So there are structural kind of realities that continue to unfold in the U.S. And just one fact that I'll share with you, and you can do whatever you want to with that fact, but the last survivor of the U.S. transatlantic slave trade died in 1940. My own father was born in 1939. So in my own father's lifetime, there was still a person alive who had experienced the transatlantic slave trade firsthand as an individual. That was during my own father's life. And then the last African American born into slavery died in 1972. I hate to give away my age, but as it turns out, this is 2 years after I was born. And so during my own lifetime, I crossed over with, or I intersected with a person who had actually been born into slavery within my own lifetime. So it's important just to understand that the years maybe give us a false sense of how far away those practices were. But when you think of it at the human scale, we're maybe more connected to it than we realize. So it looked something like this. And as I've already, I think, kind of mentioned, slavery from Africa to the New World didn't occur from all of Africa into all of the New World. There were very specific geographic patterns. And so if you are connected to slavery, most likely genetically you are connected to West Africa, and you can see the regions right here. And so that has a lot to do with your own biology, with your own kind of medical history, and your own identity. But let's get some data. How many Africans were sent to the New World? And these are numbers that I would expect you to know for an exam or a quiz. And the answer is about 12 million. These are estimates. That's why I have the symbol here. How many arrived in the New World? So this includes all of the Americas. And that number is about 10 million. So we know that upwards of 10% died during the journey from all sorts of reasons, from suicide, from malnutrition, from disease. But more specifically, how many of that 10 million arrived on the shores of the United States? And this is a number that usually surprises students. And that number is around 450,000. It could be a little higher, it could be a little bit lower. This is the middle figure that we have estimated. And so the largest recipient of black slaves from Africa was Brazil by far. And after that, it's a number of Caribbean islands. So Hispaniola, Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, places like that. Here's an image, an actual image based off of a figure of what a slave ship looked like. And so there was only enough space for each person to lie down, and that was it. And as I've said, you've learned this elsewhere. But one other maybe small correction that I'd like to make is that it's a little bit more complicated than just a triangle or a single direction of movement. So notice that there were a lot of items being sent out of Africa back to Europe, okay, not always to the New World, but this is the general trend of how that triangle looked. So slaves were sent mostly to, like I said, Brazil and Caribbean islands to work on plantations. And then there's a massive number of slaves that then make a secondary trip into the United States. There's also the movement of sugar and molasses to make rum up to the more industrialized parts of the United States here. And one of the questions that Georgia actually struggled with and its foundation, right? The Georgia that many of us live in, if you're a student in this class, was the question about legalization of rum and liquor in the new colony. In the same way that the United States has been struggling with the question of legality of marijuana, the same question was being taken on about alcohol. And during the first attempt to settle Georgia, alcohol was strictly forbidden. During the second group of settlement under Oglethorpe that you probably learned about if you went to school in Georgia, alcohol was made legal again. So let's talk about migration of African Americans in the post-emancipation era. I think I've already covered the Great Migration before when we talked about migration, but I want to get into it just a little bit more. So there's this central question. Following emancipation, very few African Americans left the South for about 40 years. I think any human logic would tell us that if you're freed from enslavement, you would probably want to leave, right? You'd want to move. But the answers are kind of complex and kind of simple at the same time. The simple answer is that most people couldn't move. Moving takes money, it takes resources. The other thing that's true is that Northerners were not necessarily accepting of new African Americans settling in their own neighborhoods. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. But here's the secondary answer, sort of the structural answer, that we have two migration waves of African Americans out of the South and into the North, known as the Great Migration. And why does it finally happen? The answers are fairly simple. First of all, there are jobs, new industrial jobs, right? So America is rapidly industrializing. And when we talked about migration, we understand that migrants were coming from Europe in the early 20th century for jobs, not for land, right? Not to work as farmers, but because new factories were hiring all the time. A lot of those jobs were not necessarily open to African Americans from the South. But white workers during a time of war were gone to war. So there is a demand, a massive demand for labor, and capitalists and factory owners are looking around for a source of labor that they can use in the absence of their white workers. And immigration has slowed down because of the Great War. And what they find is that there is a source of labor that's sort of ready and willing and available. And that source of labor is found in the South. So black workers en masse begin to move to northern cities. And finally, the demand for industrial goods increases during a time of war, right? So there's a higher demand for bullets and ball bearings and all of the kind of machinery of war. So the demand for industrialized goods goes up, the supply of labor goes down, and so there's a massive actually recruitment and outreach to bring African Americans out of the South and into northern cities. Once one group does it, then we have chain migration, which we learned about in chapter 3, right? So once a group kind of takes that first risky step to a northern city, then their family members come along maybe later, and the word gets out that there are higher paying jobs in northern cities than what are available in the South. And so that's what we see. So the Great Migration leads to massive population growth of African American populations in the North, but in very specific cities. The same cities that you think of when you think of the Industrial Revolution or manufacturing of cars and tractors and everything else are the same places that were recruiting and actively bringing African Americans to the North. One of the things that I didn't understand as a kid growing up in rural Illinois was that when I would travel to the South and I would look out my window, I would see black people on farms, because in the American Midwest, you rarely see that. And in my childlike mind, I just remember thinking that black people don't like to farm or something. I don't know what the explanation was. I'm being a little vulnerable here on purpose, because we all have misunderstandings of things when we're younger. And as we become more educated, we understand them differently, right? So the reason that African Americans are focused in the city, in specific parts of the city in the American North, is because of this whole process: recruitment, chain migration, and also they were encoded to live only in certain neighborhoods. So this is the formation of kind of the American ghetto in places like St. Louis and South Chicago. So tenement housing is offered to these new industrial workers. So along with taking a job, people are kind of offered a place to live, and tenement housing is a term that refers to really densely packed, privately owned residential housing that's usually reserved for industrial and factory workers. It's usually really close to the factory, within walking distance, and so that's what we had. Immigrant workers lived in tenement housing, and then African Americans lived in usually a different set of tenement housing, so there wasn't mixing. And during this time, it was prohibited for African Americans to live outside of particular areas or particular neighborhoods. There was also restriction of movement. Maybe you've heard of this movie called The Green Book. It was nominated for an Academy Award a few years ago. But this is a real book that was offered to African Americans to let them know as they were traveling outside of the South of places where they could stay as a black person along their journey between the North and the South, or if they wanted to travel as a tourist, because most hotels and most neighborhoods would not be welcoming to a black man or a black family that was traveling during this period of American history. So also we have this legal separation that, again, I'm guessing every student here has already learned about this, but the United States Supreme Court decides that a physical separation by races is lawful as long as the separation is equal. We now know that that separation wasn't really equal, but we have that enshrined into law, followed by restrictive covenants within neighborhoods. So even in areas where the law didn't require people to be separated by races, there were HOA covenants. If you live in an HOA, you know what an HOA is. There are rules now about what fence you can build or what car you can have on your lawn. But earlier in the 20th century, those laws would extend to race. So when you moved into a neighborhood, you had to be of a certain race, and you were forbidden from selling your house to most often a black family or a Jewish family in the early part of the 20th century. We also had redlining. So again, even if there wasn't a law in place, banks, through their own actions, insurers and financial institutions made decisions, and they would draw red lines on a map of certain neighborhoods where they would give loans and certain neighborhoods where they wouldn't. So residential segregation was codified into law, and we still see those patterns again on the map today, not just at the national scale, but even inside of specific cities. So the doctrine of separate but equal is broken down in 1954, and everything has been sort of desegregating since then. So this term, that the ghetto, is sort of a pejorative term now, but it actually comes from an Italian area where Jews were forced to live, and the Jewish ghetto was dissolved in 1870, but then it was kind of recreated in American society, and so, just so you understand where that term comes from. So let's move away from the United States again and look at this in a few different parts of the world. You've probably learned about South Africa apartheid, which means living apart. And so apartheid comes about in South Africa, and it stays in place from 1948 to 1990. And it's specifically the physical separation by race into different geographic areas that was encoded into law. There were 4 racial categories: black, white, colored, which is mixed. You could also think of that as mulatto, and then Asian. And one significant difference here is that when you were born during this time of apartheid, your race was determined in the hospital or wherever you were born. It's encoded, it's stamped on your birth certificate. In the United States, we don't do that. Data is collected about the mother and the father, which is included in your birth record, but the child, the baby in the United States, is not given a racial categorization. And that's because race and ethnicity are left up to the individual to decide for themselves, going back to a topic from part 1 of this lecture. So reclassification under apartheid was very difficult, almost impossible, and oftentimes dangerous or illegal. Maybe you've heard of this comedian named Trevor Noah in the United States, a pretty famous guy, and he experienced this. He was born to a white father and a black mother, which is a crime, right? So interracial sex and interracial marriage was illegal during this time of apartheid, and yet he was the progeny of exactly that. So depending upon what your race is on your birth certificate, that would determine where you could live, what jobs you could have, what resources you could or couldn't have access to, what schools you could go to, all this sort of stuff. So apartheid in South Africa worked very much the way that it did in the United States. There were white only and black only kind of drinking fountains and neighborhoods. But it was taken then to a whole nother level in South Africa. So why did this happen, right? Was it just random? Well, it has to do with demography. Demography is destiny, remember. So over time, white South Africans began to be notice that they were outnumbered by black South Africans. In the 1950s, we're beginning to move into a period of racial kind of awakening. It doesn't really unfold until the 1960s. But nonetheless, there's a fear among the white minority, also known as mostly Afrikaners and the Boers, that that black Africans would sort of rise up against their power politically and economically. And so the plan was to create 10 homelands for blacks that ensured geographic isolation of different races. It also required special papers for people to move in and out of those homelands. So it's a pure and brazen attempt to kind of isolate those that are in greater number from securing power for themselves or rising up against the power of the numerically smaller group. So this is what the homelands looked like, and this is how it manifested. So maps were drawn and people were moved, people were displaced. And the way that South Africa framed this was that these are now brand new nations, brand new countries, and they should be recognized as independent states. That's how they broadcast this to the rest of the world, but the rest of the world didn't really accept that. They could see that this was really an attempt by one racial group in South Africa to secure most of the land and maintain it for themselves, and to sort of use violence and barriers to keep people separated by race. And so here's just some images, some documentary images from that time. One thing that happened was that the military was used for domestic causes, to keep people from traveling freely outside of their homelands, and fences were built and all that kind of stuff that you can imagine. To much of the world's surprise, this all changed in the 1990s. So Nelson Mandela, who had been a freedom fighter and had stood up against the oppression of apartheid, spends 27 years in prison, but he's freed in 1990, and he runs as a free man for election and is elected as president of a free South Africa in 1994. Next, let's talk about a few more definitions. Nationality is mostly a legal attachment, but in some cases there's not a legal attachment. It could be an allegiance to a particular country. So somebody might move to a country, they might have a passport that says the United States, but they still might consider their real attachment to be the country that they moved from, right? Maybe that's true of some Mexican Americans, for example. But by and large, nationality is what your passport says that you are, your legal attachment to a place. Okay, there's nothing very controversial about nationality. Nationalism is different from nationality. Nationalism is a series of actions. It's a unifying force that enhances support for the state, and or a centrifugal force that might lead to the fragmentation of the state. So you might say to yourself, okay, so you're giving me a definition that has two completely different meanings, right? and the meanings are opposite of one another. So let me tease that out. Okay, so in the case of centripetal forces, people can be unified under the same flag, right? They can feel a really strong sense of belonging to that place. But nationalism can also be used, usually by political leaders, to make one group feel like that they strongly belong to the nation and that other groups, usually minority groups, are separate, that they shouldn't get the same rights and that they don't fully belong to the nation as it's defined by the most powerful group. So civic nationalism defines and coalesces national identity by a shared political set of values and institutions. So earlier in the lecture, I talked about how France doesn't collect racial data. All right, the notion of being French is very much tied to this idea of civic nationalism, that we are all French, that being French has nothing to do with whether you come from a colony of France or whether your birthplace was in an African colony that was colonized by France, or if you were born in France. We are all French, and what unites us is our love of freedom and of good food and of good wine, and those are kind of simple examples, but you get my point, right? A love of country. Ethnic nationalism is something that takes this sort of to a different level, that defines belonging based upon heritage, a set of stories that might fit for one group but not for the other group, a shared ethnic identity and ancestry, again, real or imagined, remember what that means, and inherited traits, serving wholly to include members of the dominant group and to exclude others. And this is where things get dicey. So nationalism, ethnic nationalism, has these characteristics: belief in the right of members of the nation to live within the nation state's boundaries. So you can think about Israel in this situation, right? So the nationalism of Israel means that anybody who is or believes that they are of Jewish descent, no matter what birth country they might have, has the right to return and become fully Jewish and Israeli, so that the nation and the state are one thing. There's also a belief in the exclusion of others, depending upon the dominant group definition of what that group is. So the Serbians began to feel this strongly about other groups. I'll get to that in a second. But you could make the same argument again about certain groups in the United States, believing that the United States was for one particular group of Americans, but not necessarily for another group. And then finally, belief that the government should be constituted by the culturally dominant group. And so again, this maybe doesn't sound controversial, but within a pluralistic democratic society, the idea is that everybody should have representation in the government, even if they're not in the majority group. Okay, but there are some that believe that within a democracy that the largest group gets to make all the decisions without really consideration for the smaller groups. We're seeing that play out in the United States in a variety of different conflicts in ways, and I won't go into those. I'll leave those up to you in your own discernment. So here are some examples of what we're talking about. If we look at a map of Iraq, which doesn't make the news very often, but the United States was engaged in a long conflict and war here, what you find is that there are multiple ethnic groups inside of the boundaries of a single country, with Shiite Arabs being the largest group, and they're located mostly in the south, and they're located right next to Iran, which is also majority Shiite. And then we have religiously different Sunni Arab Muslims in the north, and then finally there's another group known as the Kurds, also in the north, who consider themselves to be Sunni Muslims, but ethnically different from these Sunni Muslims. It's complicated, right? And then we could look at another situation where you have ethnic groups that cross over political boundaries between Pakistan and Afghanistan, between Pakistan and India, etc. And so this can complicate our notions of what it means to be a unified country, or nationality, or nationalism. Ethnic nationalism can lead to really dark and dangerous outcomes. So the first example is ethnic cleansing, a process in which the more powerful ethnic group forcibly removes or attempts to remove a less powerful one in order to create an ethnically homogeneous this region. We saw an example of this in the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia became a country in 1918. It united several different ethnic groups together in a single country. And this one leader, whose name was Tito, relied on civic nationalism to hold people together. Even though there were multiple ethnic groups with differences and different histories and different languages, the argument that being Yugoslavian meant to come together as a country. After his death, however, those ethnic differences bubbled to the top. And Serbia in particular longed for a homeland free of other ethnic groups and began to attempt to forcefully remove other ethnic groups from what they considered to be their homeland, their territory. And so violence was enacted upon Croats and Bosnians and Muslims from their homes, and a whole-scale civil war erupted. Finally, in the 1990s, the war ends. And today, in 2025, we now have 7 different independent countries in what used to be Yugoslavia. So this is really important. Yugoslavia does not exist. Yugoslavia is not a country and hasn't been since 1994. Instead, we have multiple other countries: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. So here's what the map of the former Yugoslavia looks like today. And you'll notice that the borders don't perfectly match the ethnic groups that those borders were designed to encapsulate. Why? It's impossible to draw a map that will do that without causing violence and disruptions and discontent among various groups. But this is what the map looks like today. Even in where we are now, there still is discontent and contestation between these borders kind of happening all the time, in particular between Serbia and Kosovo here, which I'll talk about in the next chapter. So Balkanization is the process by which a state fragments into smaller units over conflicts among ethnic groups. Right? So you can think of Balkanization as being fragmentation, okay? But it's pushed by ethnic differences. Often, group members weaponize the power of nationalism that strengthens the group of the more powerful or more numerically dominant force, but it weakens national unity. That's why nationalism is both a centripetal and also a centrifugal force. Once Balkanization begins, it's very difficult to stop, as we saw in Yugoslavia. But at any moment, there could be continued and a renewed fragmentation of Yugoslavia, even in the 21st century. So ethnic nationalism can lead to even more dark and more dangerous outcomes, especially in the form of genocide, which is the mass, not removal or just violence, but attempted elimination of a smaller group or a group that is considered to be not a part of the mainstream group. And the most obvious example of this is the Holocaust during World War II. So more recently, in the 1990s also, we have an example of possibly a genocide, depends upon your opinion on this one, but there was ethnic competition and maybe an attempted genocide in Sudan between the Arab Muslims, which dominated the north part of Sudan and tended to be Arab Muslims, and black Christians and animists in the south. So there's ethnic difference, there's also religious difference. And during the Second Sudanese Civil War, which lasted between 1983 and 2005, there was massive, not just violence, not just the violence of war, but massive torture, attempted extermination of entire villages, kidnapping, enslavement, resulting in the death of about 2.5 million civilian deaths in South Sudan at the hands of the North Sudanese. So there were accusations of genocide, but no official declarations or findings in international courts as of this recording. However, South Sudan eventually secedes and declares its own independence from Sudan. So South Sudan becomes the world's newest independent country in 2011 and is still the newest country today. We have another example of genocide or attempted genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994. Maybe you're familiar with this case if you've watched a film called Hotel Rwanda. It's a very difficult film to watch, but it's worth it. And so you have two groups, the dominant group, ethnic Hutus, and a smaller group, the ethnic Tutsis, which had mostly lived in peace together. There was a lot of intermarriage between the groups. It's very difficult physically to tell the difference between one and the other. Some have told me you can't tell the difference between them, but nonetheless there was, again, an imagined difference in a different set of stories and beliefs about these two groups that each group held. And in 1994, the president of Rwanda, who was a Hutu, a member of the larger group, was assassinated, along with a group of other political leaders. And the Hutus blame the Tutsis for that assassination, although historically we're still not sure to this date who was responsible for the assassination. Nonetheless, the Hutus became increasingly angry and blamed their own problems on the Tutsis. And they said if we could just get rid of this smaller group, that we can have a great nation again. Okay, so on a particular date in April of 1994, people of Hutu descent were called upon to leave their houses, to take whatever weapon they had, whether it was a knife or a gun or an axe or a machete, and to start killing Tutsis. And the call came on the radio, and people started to do this. And even those who had no ill will or no malice, if they refused to kill Tutsis, then the knife or the gun would be turned upon them. So this is an example of just a massive killing predicated upon ethnic difference that we have evidence of. Somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million deaths occurred in just a matter of a few months, which is kind of hard to even comprehend. As recently as 2021, there has been efforts at hope and reconciliation between the groups. So not to keep everything dark and negative around the world, there is hope for reconciliation between both groups in the 21st century. So that brings us to the end of the chapter on race and ethnicity. There's a lot to remember here, I know, and I'm guessing you know a lot of these facts already. So hopefully the chapter was able to crystallize things for you or help you to remember, or maybe provide specific examples to help you deepen your understanding, especially as a college student compared to your younger self, and how you deal with, how you understand, and how you conceptualize race and ethnicity, especially in the United States compared to other parts of the world. So just to summarize, race relates to an imagined biological marker. Ethnicity relates to a shared past and a common set of characteristics of culture, language, food, history, etc. Ethnic and racial differences can lead to segregation and violence and war. Race-based discrimination varies across time and space, but racism exists nearly everywhere on Earth in some form or another, and it probably always will. And finally, in the United States, data collection and understandings of race and ethnicity are undergoing significant changes in the 21st century. Unique to the United States and a few other countries is the flexibility, the ability to self-identify what your race or ethnicity is. It's something that can change across time. So that ends our chapter. Good luck on remembering all this stuff, and we'll see you again in chapter 8.